who believes that music can open spaces of resistance, introspection, solidarity, and internal and external repair. This workshop series is designed for anybody working at the intersection of care, art, and justice. It includes music therapists and any other creative arts therapists, mental health professionals, coaches, activists, politically engaged artists, also known as artivists, and any other organizers seeking tools to bring liberation into practice. The primary goal of this workshop is to help demystify capitalist realism, and that is the pervasive belief that there is no alternative to capitalism. Through music, collective inquiry, and embodied practice, we will explore how capitalism shapes our creativity, our nervous system, and our sense of alienation, and how we can nurture liberatory ways of healing, imagining, and being together as a human species. So across these 11 sessions, we'll move through various topics like trauma-informed care, empathetic concern, embodied mindfulness, fascism and high control dynamics, caste systems and class systems, and even personal accountability and collective accountability. So each one builds towards the praxis wheel, which is an evolving framework for ethical, responsive, and community-centered engagement. It's something that I utilize in my personal practice as a music therapist, as well as an activist and community organizer. So today's presentation is divided into 3 parts, and that is going to be engaged practice, balancing knowledge and wisdom, and liberation philosophy. Okay, so before we dive in, I want to introduce a figure who illustrates a tension that is something that we will revisit through this series, and this is Bartolomé de las Casas. So he was a 16th century Dominican friar who exposed the brutality of the Spanish conquest and fought for reforms to protect indigenous peoples. But, and this is key, he arrived as a settler. He held an encomienda, which is an enslaved indigenous person, and he even endorsed, while fighting for the rights of the indigenous, he endorsed replacing them with African slaves, because that would be more humanistic for the indigenous. So he did recant it, he did change, he did evolve, but Las Casas represents, for our purposes, the well-meaning reformer within the colonial project. So he is really an archetype of the well-meaning liberal or the well-intentioned white person. So for our purposes, he is a cautionary tale of how good intentions can perpetuate harm when we fail to practice genuine decolonial accountability. And so, you know, he's a prime example, if you want to study more about him, of somebody who did do good things within the structure, but ultimately was doing things to keep the powerful, the colonizers, in the colonies. And that's something we need to be mindful, because we can follow this lineage very easily. Something that I take into account with my own work, that when we are there, we are representing the system, or we are representing the oppressive class, or caste system, or whichever piece you may represent. We need to be mindful of that. So we're going to get into part 1, and this is engaged practice. So liberation music therapy begins with an integrated understanding of the concepts of materialism and spirituality. So materialism, or the material reality of everything we literally experience, that is our minds, the meanings that are created, the systems that we build, they arise from concrete conditions. Materialism is the understanding that everything we are working with comes from human bodies, human labor, the land, and resources. So that's the majority of this workshop is going to be around material conditions and understanding the material reality and how things function and operate in a real way. One piece that many socialist and liberatory movements, I believe, and many others, as I'm starting to just catch on to, is the lack of a spiritual understanding within social movements. Because when we're working with real people, we're working with a lot of different ways of expressing spirituality. It can be through religious practice, it can be through just the way you organize your life. But the way that we're going to be concerning spirituality is the relational practice of connecting to meaning, purpose, or something larger than ourselves, what sustains compassion and grounding. Every time the fascist or the capitalist or the colonizer use the argument that human beings are instinctively narcissistic and instinctively violent and instinctively ready to tear each other apart, completely disregards the history of the human species anytime a natural disaster takes place or a horrific event takes place, because human beings gather together and community bonds actually grow stronger during those moments. There's a very good, and I'll put this in the show notes for after the fact when this video goes out, but there was a good insight by Peter Kropotkin on his work with mutual aid, studying a continuation of Darwin's concepts of evolution and how we evolve and adapt for survival. And one of the pieces of human survival is mutual cooperation. And this was later expanded in recent work, more recent work by Stephen Jay Gould, who is a biologist, well-known popular scientist, kind of did a lot of what Neil deGrasse Tyson or Bill Nye for our generation may think of. But he was probably more aligned with Carl Sagan because he was a working scientist and journalist on science as well as a popularizer. He didn't do a TV show or anything like that, but he did books and writing. And so he wrote about expanding on Kropotkin's work on the concept of mutual aid and the concept of how humans do take care of each other and have a greater meaning. And so for our purposes, today is just looking at the spiritual concepts and what spirituality actually means when we're communicating with other human beings. And we are not going to be talking about any religious faith. We're not going to be talking about anything supernatural. This is all going to be about embodied practice when we're talking about spirituality. So the sentence I put in my notes before I go to the next slide that I think is important to say is this workshop is centered on understanding material reality and demystifying these social forces. However, it is essential to establish spiritual grounding before entering the field of oppression and suffering. So this is a little bit from the Buddhist school of thought, but this can be applied to many religious practice. I had a very good conversation with a good comrade and colleague whom I work with, Lucius Jokanen, and he's a Christian. I am not a Christian, and we had a very good conversation in his Shadow Talk dialogue series on the concept of suffering, and I shared with him some of the Buddhist concepts of suffering, and we really had just a good discussion on how Christianity tackles the concept of suffering as well as Buddhism, but there are many practices. Secular humanism even addresses this. So When we say suffering, we are saying that suffering is the emotional, physical, and collective pain caused by harm, loss, and injustice. We encounter it daily. We encounter it in our clients. We encounter it in our communities, and we encounter it in ourselves. If you have experienced any form of abusive relationship, whether it be one you were in or one you witnessed, you have experienced suffering in your life. It is that ongoing longing. That's one thing the Buddhists speak about. Uh, Christianity does speak about this a lot as well, and I do not want to speak about any religions in any serious way. I just know that when I've spoken to Muslims and spoken to Christians and spoken to Buddhists and spoken to many people about the concepts of suffering, it's really how we relate to the world and how we address that suffering. That is what spirituality is, or that is what a spiritual practice is. So one concept that I really, really appreciate is to be engaged versus being entangled. So to be engaged means staying present with suffering while maintaining clarity, boundaries, and self-care. Whereas to be entangled means losing ourselves in suffering, carrying more than we hold, becoming overwhelmed and absorbing the harm beyond your capacity. It's our task. It's not to avoid suffering. That's an impossible thing to do. But it's to meet suffering skillfully, to be attuned without dissolving. A really good analogy that I have heard, and I believe this was Thich Nhat Hanh, but I may be incorrect. Actually, it might be Larry Ward. But the analogy that I heard that I really appreciate about engaged versus entangled is, if you are entangled, you see a house and the house is on fire. You run into the house. You save as many people as you can. You grab as many people. You help as many people as you can. You have no support. You have no gear with you. You are doing this completely just because you are there, and you know people are in there who are going to be harmed, and so you're going into this house to do that. However, the likelihood of you being harmed by rushing in this way and by experiencing things without a plan or without organization, you will likely perish. And you will not be able to go to another burning house tomorrow and protect and help those people. Now, this is a space of privilege. So, for instance, if you are in the midst of a genocide and you are one of the victim types of a genocide, we're not having a discussion about a person in that type of a circumstance. We're talking about people who can make the choice to step into a place of oppression and suffering. We're talking about that. So when we have the choice to step into these places, we need to go engage. So with the fire analogy, the house on fire, being entangled, running in, saving as many people as you can, no gear, no support, no plan, no prior training necessarily, heroic, but you might perish, and the likelihood of you perishing is high, and you will not be able to save a house that is on fire tomorrow or the next day. Being engaged is seeing a house on fire, and you know exactly what to do. You have the gear, that you've done many, many training exercises in which you've gone through many different types of houses. You've practiced with other people who have had experience going through burning houses. You have a history and a lineage of different ways that people have worn gear or communicated inside and outside the burning house. You can still perish. There is still a likelihood of perishing if you go into this situation. But the likelihood of being able to survive is much higher. You're also taking care of your own self. Because I will tell you all from personal experience that when we go into these dark places in a more entangled way, or let me put it this way, when we are not going in with an engaged practice, that means that we are more likely to harm ourselves, which means we are more likely to harm our communities. And this is one reason it's important for us as practitioners to really work on being engaged when we go into these spaces of heavy oppression and heavy suffering. And I'm not going to specify on what that means. This could be sexual abuse counseling. This could be a support group. This could be a class you teach. This could be a prison. This can be anywhere where you are, where there is oppression that you are aware of, that you have the privilege of being able to step in and out of that space. Then we as practitioners need to focus on being engaged, not entangled. So some resources y'all can check out on your own. Thich Nhat Hanh has 14 practices of engaged Buddhism, which is just a very good list. If you want, you can replace the word Buddhism with your own practice. It literally works. I once replaced it with secular humanism. The entire thing works as just a way to develop a practice, but I'm not going to be showing that here. The other is Bell Hooks took from Thich Nhat Hanh's concept of engaged Buddhism and applied it in a concept called engaged pedagogy. And she speaks very much about the communal aspects of engaging a classroom and how to engage a classroom in a very healthy and holistic way. It is, if you are not familiar with Bell Hooks' work, she is an extremely important social theorist, especially within the critical pedagogy and education realms. And she specifically wrote from her personal experience, as well as just some of the best scholarship I think that is out there on the experience of Black womanhood within the contemporary United States capitalist system. And she writes about Black feminism and intersectional feminism in some of the best ways that I've personally seen. And she has written a lot about engaged pedagogy. And I believe the books are Engaged Pedagogy is like the first one. And the second one is Transgressions in Teaching, or Teaching for Transgressions, something like that. But if you type in transgression in teaching, it will literally be the only option that shows up. Yeah, so we're going to go on for our purposes to part 2. This is balancing knowledge and wisdom. And so for our purposes, you can do your own individual practice on how you develop your own engaged concepts. And I put forward the Thich Nhat Hanh 14 precepts of engaged Buddhism, as well as the Bell Hooks engaged pedagogy concepts as ways that have personally helped me in sort of understanding my spiritual practice and my communal organizing practice or facilitating practice. But that being said, it really is for you to learn for what makes sense for your own practice, your own spiritual space. So for the purposes of this course, we're going to be talking about how to balance knowledge and wisdom. So what are knowledge and wisdom? The way that we're going to define it here is knowledge is awareness, and it can come from observation, it can come from study, it can come from lived experience, it can come from reliable information. It can involve facts, practiced skills, or direct familiarity with people, places, and lived experiences. Wisdom is the art of skillfully applying, or the capacity to apply, knowledge with discernment and care. It blends experience, perspective, ethics, and emotional intelligence to make choices that reduce harm and nurture well being, especially when conditions are uncertain or complex. So, knowledge is the cultivating of, of learning and cultivating either skills or information or experiences. Whereas wisdom in this concept, at least within our engaged practice, is how you apply that knowledge with discernment. Now, I'll give just one personal example as a music therapist, and I'll use the prison system as the place. Through knowledge, I have learned that hip hop music is one of the most influential and most important music art forms used within the prison structure, the carceral structure. So I know that I need to come prepared with lots of hip hop music, and I have to have a lot of knowledge about hip hop music, the artists, the genres, the age areas, the lineage, all those factors. But there has to be wisdom applied. There has to be discernment. Because, for instance, if I go into a room and it is all 19-year-olds from the Bronx, and they are all gang involved, they are all poverty involved, and I look at them, and I come in with, let's say, an artist like Tupac as the first artist to start with, that can actually be extremely racist and extremely ageist. And the reason why is I have just shown that I'm looking at an entire group of people as so monolithic that I am going to, as a white male, going to go to the most obvious black hip hop artist of my generation who is going to be talking about high level stuff, whereas I am talking to an entirely different generation of black youth who that is not necessarily their music. It may be the music that they hear all the time. There might actually be even some super fans of Tupac in there. But with discernment, you have to understand that by showing up that way, you are actually showing how out of touch you are and how ignorant you are, how racist your behavior is, because you don't see them as individual human beings or as a collage of humanity. You see it as a blanket group, a monolithic group of black people. And that's where wisdom comes in. So I have to come in and know that if I play K Flock, it's going to get a different response than if I play Tupac. If you don't know the difference between K Flock and Tupac, now you know what you have to learn. So they're both hip hop artists, and the folks I work with, K Flock has a much bigger impact on the actual relationship building. So in this balancing, a way to conceptualize it is there are three ways of processing knowledge or taking in knowledge, and there are three ways of wisdom or discernment. And so that would be knowledge that, or just like knowing facts, for instance. We know that an A440 frequency is going to sound the pitch of an A no matter what. If I make anything that is a frequency that goes to 440, it's going to buzz an A pitch. These are extremely important things to know, especially in our work. For instance, knowing facts about gun violence is something that I've found extremely important in this liberation work. There is an organization known as the Violence Project, and it is the largest database of mass shooters and the largest psychological study done on the psychology of mass shooters. I believe it starts in 1966. They released the first like long form book, which is a super banger if you're into reading about just important information about data and violence and social reform. But the book is also called The Violence Project, and they found, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but they found that every mass shooter has four characteristics that they all share. And that is a moment of crisis, a study period, access to weaponry, and opportunity to commit an act. So, meaning that there were no mass shootings in places where people couldn't get to. That is a consideration that you have to consider. There was always opportunity. The majority of mass shooters gained their weapons through legal means. The reason I'm bringing this up is, knowing facts, I know that it is more likely, if you have armed security at a school, that a mass shooter is going to show up, or that violence is going to show up. Because in the study of mass shooters, most mass shooters are not sociopaths or narcissists or antisocial personality disorder. They are much more likely to be people who are struggling with extreme despair. So people who are struggling with suicidal and homicidal ideation. One of the reasons many mass shooters kill themselves is because they don't want to deal with the trauma of what they just did. They are committing suicide and going out in a large way. This is important. I don't want to write off knowing facts. It's the centerpiece of our knowledge. We need to know the material realities, the data. We need to know the skills. That gets us to the next one, which is knowledge how. Knowing how to perform a skill. It's embodied learning. So this is like playing an instrument, or knowing how to dance, or knowing how to ride a bike. Knowing how to do a skill. This is the embodied knowledge. I know people that are listening here have experience with professional dance. Of course, the embodied knowledge is extremely important, but we also have the knowledge that, or the propositional knowledge, the factual knowledge that helps us do things better with the knowledge how. We also have the knowledge how that helps us understand the knowledge that a little better. Sorry if this is getting too confusing with the how and that, but the point is that we have knowledge of information and knowledge of doing actions. The third form of knowledge is the experiential knowledge, and this is knowing something direct firsthand. I can tell you what a piano sounds like, but if I play a piano, you know what a piano sounds like. You know the difference between a guitar and a piano just by hearing it. You do. You as a person. That is our knowledge by acquaintance, our experiential. Another example, just to get it out of music terms, but you know the taste of a strawberry because you have tasted a strawberry. So I'll give one last real example for each: knowledge that, knowledge how, knowledge by, and then move to wisdom. Knowledge that. You know that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level. Knowledge how. You know how to ride a bike for the rest of your life. Knowledge by acquaintance. You know what a strawberry tastes like because you have tasted a strawberry. Cool. Moving on to wisdom. So wisdom unfolds also in 3 dimensions. This is reflective wisdom, which is insight. That is recognizing our patterns and limits, holding humility and curiosity. It takes a lot to self-acknowledge. It is hard to acknowledge, for instance, that I, as a person who did not grow up with very much money, still experienced a massive amount of privilege based on the fact that I was born male, I present as male, I identify as male, I'm white-skinned, white-bodied, so I walk through this world with certain things that I have to be aware of that I did not earn. They were just given to me. And I have to be aware that that is happening. So this is just to give some ideas on insights. We have to acknowledge when we're angry about things, or when we're upset, or when we're disturbed. I will tell you all from personal experience, I am very choosy when I watch violent videos that pop up on social media. People go, "Did you see?" I go, "Hold on. What is it about?" The person will describe it to me. And I say yes or no. Because I've seen too much violence in my life. And sometimes I need to literally say, no, I don't need to see that. I have enough reflective wisdom to know that that will not do me any good to take in this new piece of information. Now we get to practical wisdom. The Greeks called it phronesis, but this is making skillful decisions in real time, in tangible situations. So, like street smarts or reading the room, it's just being able to make an action that fits into context. I'll tell you all, just like as a musician, like this is when you're in the moment and you just put the right thing in. You don't overshare, you don't undershare. You're just being right in the moment. You don't know what the right chord is, but you definitely know what the wrong chord is when you play it. If that makes any sense. It's almost the discernment of moving through life. So we've got practical wisdom, which is the discernment of understanding what's going on internally within ourselves and our own humilities and lack of knowledge. And the practical wisdom, which is making skillful decisions in real time. And this gets us to the final, which is relational wisdom, and that's compassion. And that is attuning to the needs and dignity of others, that the interconnectedness of others, and having an awareness that harm and healing ripple across relationships. I will tell you all, just an example, if you are in a relationship with somebody and you lie to that person for your own somatic processing, and I'm talking about like cheating on a person, it may not feel like it impacts you. But that does have an impact on other people. And so there is a thought process on being mindful on our relationships. And the reason I'm going right to sexual relationships is that is one of the most challenging areas for us as human beings to treat with respect and treat with dignity. And so we're going to talk a lot during this course about sexual abuse, unfortunately, because that is a big piece of what happens in these spaces, and we need to know how to work through them and process through them. But the point is that when you have power, you have to understand and navigate with serious relational wisdom. You have to be aware of what your behavior and engagement can do to harm others. Now, we'll get into it much later. This can be abused the way that I'm speaking right now. This is not about rigid rules. Wisdom is about being reflective. It's about being able to navigate. It's about being able to move through the forest. You don't know the path because the path is completely covered, but you know how to move through the jungle because you've done it a million times. That's what we're talking about with wisdom. We're going to get to the final part of the presentation, liberation philosophy. And I'm not really going to cover too much about it because the whole course is really about liberation philosophy. But this is just a breakdown on what we're actually getting towards. Why are we developing an engaged practice? It is so we can move through the world in a productive and healthy and holistic way for the community, for the people, for the human beings. So liberation philosophy can be broken down into a couple of tenets, pillars, if you will. The first and most important is centering the marginalized. The most impacted by structural violence hold the most crucial insight and leadership for liberation. Now, we're going to talk about this because there is a bourgeois way that we think of leadership. There is a upper class way we think of leadership, even if you're not from the upper class. If you went to college, you were taught a certain way of leadership, or if you went into a business or a trade, you were taught a certain type of leadership. And when we go into another social class or another social caste, leadership can be interpreted in different ways. So it's very important for us to get out of our own ways and out of our own colonizer way of thinking and identifying what leadership actually looks like within the marginalized communities and learn from that leadership. Because these people in these horrific situations know how to navigate these spaces more than anybody else on the planet. So it's extremely important to center the marginalized. Critique of power and hegemony. So the liberation philosophy is about identifying and dismantling how domination is normalized through culture, economy, and institutions. We just have it normal for the longest time that American television was just supposed to be white people. We just wrote off entire groups of people. We act like indigenous people are extinct. There are indigenous people that live in New York City who never left New York City. They were here before it was New York City. But this is one of those pieces. We need to dismantle decolonial epistemology or decolonial knowledge. And this is about valuing and restoring suppressed ways of knowing and wisdom. There are issues. I think the cult recovery space is an extremely important space for helping to identify working with an authentic indigenous practitioner or a con artist, because there are con artists. And that is not only a psychological issue, but it is also a systemic issue that people utilize con artistry as a way to survive and navigate this capitalist system. So we're also talk about that it is collective and individual. So it's rooted in communities and movements struggling for dignity, justice, and freedom. So we are worried about our community, our human species, as well as ourselves and our human body. And finally, there's praxis, which is reflection plus action. So that is knowledge must move towards material change. We study oppression in order to interrupt it. And so that really gets us to the lineage of liberation philosophy, or the historical development. So we would not have liberation philosophy if it were not for the original anti-colonial and revolutionary movements that are challenging, either in the past or currently challenging, cultural hegemony. There is liberation theology, which is a practice that developed in South America, Brazil. We'll learn more about it, but it is grounded in the preferential option for the poor. It is grounded, it is a concept, it is a philosophical movement that is grounded. The basis is putting the options of the poor first. Poverty first. The needs of poverty are put first. Decolonial thought, and this is seeking to disentangle people from or to delink from the colonial power structures. For instance, I joke, but I'm not joking at all. The largest cult in the world is patriarchy. It's a 10,000-year-old cult, or a 10,000-year-old high dynamic group that has slowly, systematically divided human species into two categories of groups. And there are people who fight for these rigid categories to stay in place. It's just something that we need to critique and understand so we can delink from these ways of thinking. And then critical pedagogy. This is about really centering about conscientization, or the waking up of consciousness for people. And really the center of this entire workshop is liberation psychology, which is the pursuit of de-ideologizing the psyche of domination. So as music therapists and activists, our task is to continue the work and the roots that our human ancestors have laid down in music making, in practice, and the relationships we build. So for next week, we'll explore the praxis wheel. which is, I'll put it in the show notes, but it's an 8 spokes of ethical and transformative engagement from a trauma-informed care to understanding justice. You're more than welcome to attend as many or as few of these as you can. Each stands alone, but it does form a much larger arc. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking your mental health seriously. Thank you for bringing your practice and your presence. Thank you for helping to imagine a world beyond capitalist realism. Let's continue to make music that heals, remembers, and resists. I'll leave this up on the screen, and I'll also put these in the show notes. I am putting the ability for donations, either Venmo, PayPal, or Cash App. This is not a requirement, and this workshop is open to anybody who wants to attend. There is not a cost. If you cannot give 2 cents, do not give 2 cents. Keep that 2 cents. This is free for everybody, but the donations help me make this work more possible. And finally, please stay connected. You can check out my website, dorianwallace.com, projects for performances and resources. And then my Substack, doriansmode.substack.com, where I put essays, information about workshops.
Welcome back, everybody, to week
music,
2
music
of the Liberation
Reflections.
Music Therapy series. Tonight's focus is on the Praxis Wheel. It's an activist framework and the central framework of this entire workshop. So last week we had talked about engaged and entangled. This week we're starting with the Praxis Wheel, what it is, and every week for the rest of it we're going to go through each segment of the Praxis Wheel. But today is just what is liberation psychology and what is the Praxis Wheel. So that's really what it's about. A little history on the Praxis Wheel. It's a little concept that I use for my own practice, and it is meant to help guide us as facilitators as we practice with safety, with dignity, with shared power, and with justice. So we'll just do a little review of what's to come. As you can see, week 1 was being engaged, not entangled, which is the spiritual foundation of your own spiritual and or religious practice. Spirituality in our context is an embodied practice, the embodied practice of meaning making and community making. It can be done through many religions. It can be done through non-religions. But the point is that when we're talking about spirituality in this context, we're talking about the embodied spirit experience of meaning and human connection. So that is the most important piece for our work, which is establishing a safe, grounding place so that we can be our best selves when we are facilitating and when we are working with the communities in which we are serving. And so today's format, part 1, we're going to cover a little bit about liberation psychology, and part 2, we're going to cover the Praxis Wheel. Cool. So part 1, liberation psychology. So a reminder from last week, liberation psychology comes from a school of philosophy, which is liberation philosophy. Of course, there would be no liberation philosophy if there were not anti-colonial and revolutionary movements. So we can consider the first Maroon Wars in Jamaica from 400 years ago, the Haitian Revolution, the Indian Independence Movement, the Irish Land Wars, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Watts Rebellion, Zapatistas in Chiapas, the Algerian and South African struggles against apartheid, the Palestinian resistance, Black Lives Matter, the Civil Rights Movement, Stonewall Uprising. All of these pieces are moments of political liberations, and that is the root of everything that this work comes from. And aside from political liberations, all of these movements include a psychological liberation as well. There's a reclaiming of the right to exist with dignity. The other historical context, there's liberation theology, And liberation theology arose when faith communities began organizing in spaces of extreme poverty. It really regards to the lineage of which this practice is coming from. It comes from Latin America, from a Peruvian priest named Gustavo Gutierrez, and he centered his work on the concept of the preferential option for the poor, meaning that as a person, and he was speaking about priesthood, but for a person who engages with the community, you always side with the oppressed first. You always side with the underclass first and work your way upward. This is a type of theology that we've seen across the Black American communities within what might be called the Black church or in the gospel tradition. There's a lot of Black liberation theology. For instance, James Cone wrote that God is Black. So there are many, many ways of interpreting a liberation, people-centered, Jesus-oriented practicing of Christianity. Just to give a couple other examples of where really strong liberation theology movements has happened, but there's been Dalit theology in India, which is the underclass, lowest class within the caste system. Palestinian liberation theology. There have been feminist and queer theologies. There's even a very active deaf and disabilities theology movement working on just theological reclaiming on what language and what processing of the spirit even is. Decolonial thought, which is really the concept of delinking from colonialism. Thinkers like Frantz Fanon, thinkers like Amy Cesar, this is where we are really reconstructing our minds, the way we categorize things, the way we conceptualize our institutions, and where that colonial logic may fall into place. So it's really about uprooting those deep colonial roots. That's what decolonial thought is all about. Critical pedagogy, that's Paulo Freire's school of thought, and we would call it the pedagogy of the oppressed. And this is where education is not considered a filling of a container. It's not a banking model, but it should be a dialogue. So there should be an opening up to helping people learn and open things and start to expand. We'll get into the real words and terminology momentarily, but really the concept is about conscientization or the waking up. And I'll tell you all that when I'm working with, for instance, Black and brown youth, specifically, I am a 40-year-old white male who is sometimes the first white male that is speaking to this person that is not a cop, not a judge, not any of those elements. And that's also, just to be very frank, that's a bit of racism in and of itself too, because a lot of times the judges and the cops that they're working with are also from the same communities. And we like to just continuously whitewash cultural hegemony to not actually address the real people in the real circumstances. But I make sure that I have an open door policy on any topic, especially with the youth. I've had the most uncomfortable conversations in my life with 15-year-olds asking me about the specifics about the Klan and neo-Nazis because they want to know what it's about. Partially, they want to make me uncomfortable. Partially, they want to make the other adults in the room uncomfortable. And so part of it is they're being 15-year-old kids. But part of it is 15-year-old kids ask those questions that everybody wants to ask. White dude shows up in a room, and they all seemingly want to ask about white hate groups. But the point is that by actually allowing that space, by being cool, by being chill, by just being like, oh, yeah, let's talk about it. Okay. Like, I answer every question honestly. I don't hide the fact that I have members of my family who may be associated not with that specific hate group, but definitely groups that are on closer to that than I would maybe like to acknowledge myself. Not necessarily the closest family members, but the point is that they are in my family. They are part of my lineage. So I talk about that with my kids, and that actually expands the consciousness, because when you break through the obvious things, there can be some human understanding. I also never deny any time my privilege gets in the way. In fact, sometimes I try to make a joke first, and that actually ends up being much better at the, just on communicating. Like if somebody says they were going to say something, and so I interrupted you, I go, don't worry about it. I'm a white dude. I probably needed to shut up anyways. Yeah, see, people are laughing in the space. So, it works. Like it works. It really does work. So all of this to get to liberation psychology, which is the centerpiece of liberation psychology, is about de-ideologization, or stripping away the ideologies that we've been psychologized to believe. Now, because this course is open to not just mental health professionals, and I am in the developmental stage of this to actually make this a real certified course. This is my getting all the stuff out, seeing how it works. But because this is open to activists and anybody who is in the helping professions, who is working in spaces in which you are working with people who are struggling, there's just a political dynamic that you need to be aware of. By the way, that is literally everybody. But if you're not trained in psychology, I'm just going to give a little brief history on psychology just so we can get into what liberation psychology is. So first, we've got the ancient roots. And so way before Freud, way before Wundt, there were communities, there were human beings in Africa, in Asia, the indigenous Americans, the Mediterranean, coming up with complex systems of mind, complex systems of healing. For instance, the Yorubans' understanding of communal and ancestral balance, or Buddhist mindfulness as an awareness of suffering and compassion. In Islam, there was a serious medicinal philosophy connected to body, mind, spirit, and morality. The Lenape, here on the land that I currently occupy, other indigenous cosmologies centered the relationship with earth and reciprocity. Greek philosophers were studying the concepts of perception, virtue, and debate. So these are all pre-scientific, part of the human experience of holistically understanding the mind, the body, the spirit, and the politic. So for our purposes, psychology officially became a science in the 1800s. The first psychology labs and theories were Wilhelm Wundt, William James, Sigmund Freud. A lot of these are very important people to read. I am a strong believer that study everything. There's going to be problems with everybody. Like a joke that happens in activist circles is, if there's a time machine, never go back in time and meet your progressive heroes, because you will be disappointed. So there are issues with these folks, but the point is that things are starting to become solidified in a studyable, analyzable way of observing the brain and observing the way that we function. So some major schools of thought: psychoanalysis, and that was really looking inward, studying dreams, studying desires, studying our emotions. The unconscious mind is a very famous concept that comes out of psychoanalysis. There's behaviorism, that's really on looking outward, seeing how habits are formed, learning, observable actions, habits. This is, if you've ever heard the concept of Pavlov's dog, where they would ring the bell and the dog would drool, that is behaviorism. Basic training for the army, that is behaviorism in action. It is about doing outside things to adapt a behavior. Humanistic psychology, this is very much where I center a lot of my work, but this is about the concept of human dignity, human meaning, and human agency. So even if a person is making a horrible choice, I let them make the horrible choice, because the point is that I'm not letting them fail, but I'm also not forcing them into anything. When you are in a more humanistic role, you're working with a human being. You are not working with a patient. You are working with a human. So I really do center a lot of my practice in the humanistic school of thought. And then cognitive and neuroscience, and this is more about the actual functions of the brain, thinking, memory, the actual systems themselves. These are all very, very important things. If you're not a psychologist, don't worry about necessarily knowing all this stuff. It's good to check out, like there's a good crash course YouTube series on the history of psychology. You can watch YouTube videos just to get familiar with some of these terms, but this is just to lay a foundation. Psychology then expanded into practice. So we have psychology going into education systems, healthcare, workplaces, into the courts, community life. People have therapists. Psychologists may come in and be an expert witness. Psychology has really influenced tools like assessment, therapy, and research, how we study the way humans function. So, cool. Now you all know everything you need to know about psychology. There you go. So we get to liberation psychology. There was a huge era where Black houseless men were disproportionately getting diagnosed with schizophrenia when the more proper diagnosis was probably bipolar disorder. Now, the reason being, behaviorally, on the outside looking in, bipolar disorder and schizophrenia can be very similar in the ups and the downs, the sporadic behavior. If you include just the stress of living on the streets, the stress of houselessness, the stress of lack of hygiene, that is actually a major piece of mental health issues that happens with houselessness. As you lose hygiene, you start to smell. People don't want to be around you. You become isolated even if you're in a room full of people, just because of an aura coming off of you. So that actually impacts the social isolation of people who may be houseless. It also creates reason why people talk to themselves, because there's nobody else to talk to. So there was a disproportionate amount of Black men who the proper diagnosis was probably bipolar disorder, but they were getting diagnosed with schizophrenia because in their psychiatric evaluations, they would talk about the state trying to chase them, the police out to get them, trying to kill them, specific cops having a specific thing out to get this specific guy. The white middle-class psychiatrist would hear everything that this Black person's lived experience was and would just be written off as paranoia. That's how these things systemically impact. And I am, just to be upfront with everybody that is watching this who is of this skin color persuasion, we need to shut up when it comes to saying, I don't think he was racist in his heart. It doesn't matter if he was racist in his heart. The way that the liberation-oriented facilitator thinks, we do not judge people. I don't judge people for being a racist person. I judge racist actions. So if you are doing something racist, you're being racist. You are racist. You're doing racism. It doesn't fucking matter if the person believes it or not. I don't care. The survivorship should be where we focus things when we are orienting around political survivorship. Anyways, liberation psychology, it's rooted in the Latin American liberation movements. As we had mentioned, liberation theology, Pablo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, concept of conscientization, but also political economy and social theory, like feminist and intersectionality, Marxism, anarchism, and various decolonial thought. Frantz Fanon's major decolonial work was probably the biggest influence on the first author of writing about liberation psychology. That was Ignacio Martin Barrow. He was a Jesuit priest and a social psychologist. And the concept that he focused all of his work around was psychology must stand with the oppressed. If we are going to study the minds, we have to start at the oppressed first. I'll get a little bit more specific in a moment, but I want to talk a little bit about just some of the pieces of liberation psychology. The first is the core principle, which is conscientization. Now, that's a Portuguese word. I don't speak Portuguese, so I am probably mispronouncing it in a way that I don't really know how I'm even getting it wrong. But it translates into awareness or critical consciousness. And so all this is linking the personal experience to the social reality. So I will tell you all, I'm going to use myself as personal example to help see how some of these things break down, to see how you might be able to apply it into your own practice or find things that didn't work or just for whatever, linking the personal to the social reality. One thing that really helped me wake up about my own white privilege was when I was in the United States Army. I was a member, and there were members in my unit who were Black men. And they were battle buddies. We were tight. We were with each other for everything. I just want to